Along the slow bends of the Po River, there was once a trade so quiet, so fragile, that it depended entirely on patience. For decades, barges loaded not with gold or grain, but with baskets of ripe tomatoes, drifted from village to village, their pace dictated by the river itself. This is the forgotten story of how a handful of boatmen kept an entire region fed, and why their way of life vanished without anyone noticing. Chapter 1. Building Islands from Reeds and Patience. The first thing you notice is the smell, a faint, earthy dampness, like straw that has been soaked in lake water and left to dry in the mountain sun. It clings to everything here on the floating islands of Lake Titicaca. The smell comes from the reeds, Totora, the plant that made these islands possible, the plant that still holds them together. If you were to stand here in the late 15th century, you would feel the ground sway, very slightly under your feet. It is not unsettling, more like the slow breathing of the earth. The Euros people had learned generations earlier that solid land could be built without soil. It only required enough reeds, enough patience, and enough rope. The Totora grew thick. In the shallows, its roots tangling together in underwater mats. When the reeds aged and began to rot, their roots loosened from the lake bed and floated. The Euros saw an opportunity in this driftwood of the wetlands. They lashed the buoyant chunks together with twisted reed rope, forming the foundation for something that could last. If they kept tending it, the work was constant. Fresh layers of cut reeds had to be laid down every week for the damp layers. Beneath slowly decayed. A floating island could last decades, but only because people never stopped adding to it. Here on these islands, farming was never about plowing the earth. The crops were modest, adapted to thin mountain air and the cold that crept in at night. Potatoes grew in shallow reed baskets filled with dredged lake mud. Quinoa sprouted in small patches where the roots could grip the damp soil. The islanders hauled up in woven trays. Every stalk, every leaf was grown in something carried here by hand. The Euros' lives were bound to the lake in ways that outsiders often fail to understand. The lake provided reeds for building, fish for eating, and birds for eggs. Yet it was the ability to grow food, even in such limited quantities, that gave the Euros a measure of independence. Without those reed basket gardens, they would have been entirely dependent on trade with the Aymara people along the shore. The gardens were not pretty in the way of mainland fields. They were practical, small, uneven rectangles of green against the yellow-brown mat of the island. Yet they were arranged with care. Each plot was angled to catch the most sunlight during the short Andean growing season. The edges were lined with taller reed screens to break the wind. Farming here was an exercise in patience. At over 3,800 meters above sea level, the air was thin, and frost could come at any time of year. The Euros understood these risks intimately. They planted more than they expected to harvest. Some plants would fail, their leaves blackened overnight by ice. Others would grow slowly, taking twice the time they might need in a warmer, lower valley. Watering was never a problem. The lake was always there, but too much water could rot the roots. The baskets that held the crops had to drain well, which meant shaping them carefully and replacing them when they began to sag. It was one more task in a long list of maintenance jobs that filled the days. Life on the islands was quiet in a way that could seem empty to outsiders. But here, the quiet was a form of wealth. There was no constant worry of enemies sweeping in from the mainland. The lake acted as a barrier. Visitors came by canoe, their approach visible from far away. Trade was a slow, deliberate process, measured not in minutes, but in the hours it took for a reed boat to cross the water. The work of farming, bending over the reed baskets to plant seeds, pulling weeds, or harvesting, often happened in silence. Conversations were short, practical. The rhythm of daily life was dictated by the sound of wind over water, the splash of a paddle, the rustle of reeds. You might imagine that such isolation would lead to uniformity, but the Euros Islands were not all the same. Some were larger, holding several families and their gardens together. Others were small and private, moored to the lakebed with stone anchors, drifting just enough to remind their owners that they were not truly fixed in place. Occasionally, a piece of an island would break away. The people would watch it drift, perhaps salvaging the reeds later. If the section carried gardens, it was a loss, weeks or months of work gone to the wind and current. The lake gave, but it also took. The Spanish chroniclers who eventually passed through this region in the 16th century rarely lingered long enough to understand the details. They wrote of the Euros as a people living on the water, as if it were simply a curiosity. They did not describe the hours spent layering reeds, the slow growth of potatoes in baskets, or the way an entire community learned to read the weather. In the shape of the clouds over the hills, it is in those details that the story truly lives. The floating gardens were not simply a novelty. They were a calculated adaptation to a harsh environment. They allowed a people to live where no one else thought it possible, to anchor themselves in the shifting shallows of a high-altitude lake. And yet, even here, there were changes on the horizon, changes that would test the resilience of these floating farmers and their reed-woven world. Chapter 2: Seasons, Anchors, and the Quiet Work of Floating Agriculture. When the morning sun crests over the eastern hills surrounding Inle Lake, its light moves gently across the surface of the water, revealing hundreds of elongated green strips drifting in slow, near imperceptible motion. These are the Kionhama, the floating gardens, each one built not by chance, but by patient layering and anchoring over seasons. They are the inheritance of generations of Intha farmers who learned to coax steady harvests from a restless body of water. By the time a floating garden is ready to bear vegetables, it has already undergone months of quiet construction. The process begins with aquatic weeds, mostly water hyacinth and other buoyant plants, that the farmers collect from the open lake or from the shallow reed beds along the shore. Using long curved bamboo poles, they hook and pull these plants toward the edge of their plot, stacking them in loose mats. The mass is left to decompose slightly, becoming denser and darker, until it can support the weight of a layer of silt dredged up from the lake bottom. The lake silt is its own kind of treasure. Fine, nutrient-rich, and remarkably light when wet, it is gathered in long-handled baskets, lowered into the water, and drawn up by hand. The farmers, often working knee-deep in the shallows or balancing in the middle of their narrow canoes. Tip: these baskets over the mats until the surface is thick and even. In the first years, the mats may remain soft, so light that a person walking on them risks sinking slightly. Over time, roots will bind them together into something almost solid. It is here that the anchoring comes into play. Without a tether, a floating garden is at the mercy of the wind, which on Inle Lake can push water in great, slow swells from one end of the basin to the other. The farmers drive bamboo poles down through the mats into the muddy lake floor, ensuring the gardens remain aligned in neat parallel rows. A single garden might have dozens of such poles, each one pushed in by hand and replaced when worn by water or insects. The seasons dictate the rhythm of this work. In the dry season, when the lake is lower, building and repairing the gardens is easier. Materials are closer at hand and the winds are gentler. It is also the season when seedlings are transplanted from shore nurseries onto the mats. Tomatoes dominate these plantings, a preference that has persisted for decades, though chilies, cucumbers, and even flowers sometimes share the space. The choice is partly practical. Tomatoes tolerate the occasional rise in water level and can be picked steadily for weeks, providing a long window for market sales. When the monsoon comes, the lake swells, sometimes rising more than a meter. The anchored gardens rise with it, bobbing quietly in the gray rain. The poles bend slightly under the strain, creaking in the storm winds, but they hold. It is during this season that the farmer's skill at securing their plots is most visible. Poorly anchored gardens can drift into neighbors' rows, tangle with fishing nets, or, in rare cases, break apart entirely and be lost to the open water. Life on and around the gardens is a blend of farming and fishing. A farmer tending tomatoes in the early morning might pause to drop a small net into the water alongside his plot, returning an hour later to find a handful of fish that will become the day's meal. The lake is generous in this way, offering both soil and sustenance in the same place. The quiet work of maintenance never truly ends. Between plantings, the mats must be repaired where rot has set in, fresh weeds layered over thin spots, and silt added to keep the surface fertile. Children grow up learning how to paddle a canoe while balancing a bundle of hyacinth on one shoulder. The tools are simple bamboo poles, woven baskets, long-handled knives, but they are handled with the precision of people who have been making these same movements for a lifetime. Visitors, even those familiar with other forms of agriculture, often find the sight of these anchored fields disorienting. From a distance, they look like strips of land floating on glass, with no sign of the lake beneath them. It is only when you draw closer and hear the gentle slap of water against the mats, or see the space where a paddle slips easily beneath the crops, that the illusion breaks. The economy of these gardens has long been tied to the lake's trade. Roots. In a lake is not an isolated body of water. It connects through a series of streams and canals to other lakes and rivers, allowing produce to travel far beyond the shoreline villages. Tomatoes from Inal have found their way to markets many days' journey away, their journey beginning in the soft hum of dawn as farmers load baskets into their canoes and push off into the mist. Anchoring is as much about stability of livelihood as it is about holding a garden in place. A well-secured plot means a reliable harvest, which means predictable income, which in turn means a measure of safety for the household through the uncertain shifts of weather and water. For the Intha, whose homes are often built on stilts, above the lake itself, the anchored garden is a literal extension of the home, another room, another foundation, floating but secure. In some seasons, the lake grows crowded. More gardens are built, poles are driven deeper, and the spaces between plots narrow. Old men talk about the days when there was more open water, when the floating mats had room to drift before being pulled back into place. Now, with more mouths to feed, the gardens stretch farther out from the shore, reaching into deeper water. It is a change that has come slowly, over decades, but the older farmers notice it. They remember when anchoring a plot meant sinking a pole into the soft mud in just a few strokes. Now in the deeper stretches, it can take many pushes, and sometimes the pole must be longer than before. Yet, the core of the work has changed little. The Intha still rise with the light, still push their canoes out into the mist, still tie their livelihoods to poles sunk into an unseen bed of mud. The gardens still float, season after season, tethered not just to the lake floor, but to the rhythm of human patience. And in this rhythm lies a quiet question. As the lake shifts, as the seasons change and the floating gardens spread farther and farther, how long can the anchors hold, not just the mats, but the life they support against the slow drift of time? Chapter 3. The last seasons of the tomato barges. It began with the bridges, where the Po had once been an open ribbon for slow-moving trade. New stone and iron spans rose over it in the late decades of the 19th century. At first, they seemed harmless, a sign of progress that hardly concerned the bargemen. The river still flowed beneath, and the tomatoes still ripened each summer. But with each bridge came a better road, and with each road came carts that could carry the fruit faster than the barges. Though never more gently, the bargemen knew the roads could not match the river's softness, but buyers began to care less about softness and more about speed. A cart arriving with tomatoes on a Tuesday could sell before the weekend market. A barge arriving on Saturday had missed half the buyers already. Towns that once kept their markets on predictable days shifted their schedules, chasing the new rhythm of road deliveries. It was not that the barges had become slower. The world around them had simply learned to move faster. Some bargemen tried to adapt. They added small sailcloths to catch the wind on open stretches, or hired extra hands to row in shifts, pushing through the night to shave a day off the journey. But the river was never meant to be hurried. The faster you went, the more baskets shifted, and the more fruit split its skin before you even reached the pier. The old captains muttered that haste tasted bitter in the mouth, and their patience, which had once been a craft, began to feel like a liability. The markets themselves were changing in quiet ways. Large traders began buying tomatoes in bulk, paying less per basket, but promising to take everything at once. This made sense for farmers who wanted to clear their fields quickly, but it starved the smaller barge merchants who depended on selling basket by basket, price by price, to people who cared to pick the ripest ones. Bargemen found themselves arriving to markets where stalls were already full. They're slow, river-borne fruit treated as a curiosity rather than the day's supply, one by one. Barges stopped making the journey. Some were sold for timber, their wide planks turned into barn walls or kitchen tables. Others were left to sink quietly at their moorings, their ropes fraying, their hulls filling with rainwater until they leaned into the reeds like tired animals. The men and women who had spent seasons on the water returned to fields or took work loading faster river steamers that had little room for fragile cargo. The skill of watching a tomato for signs of travel wear faded, replaced by the blunt practicality of stacking crates. Yet for a time, in the smaller towns far from the main road, the barges still came. There, the pace of life had not yet bent to the clock, and a barge's arrival was still an expected sight in late summer. Children would run to the riverbank to watch them drift in, red cargo gleaming against the dull green water. Old buyers still pinched the fruit gently, still asked about the weather upriver, as though the tomatoes carried news as well as flavor. In those towns, the bargemen were still greeted by name, and their patience still had value. The last of the true tomato barges was said to have made its final trip in the first years of the new century. No one remembers the exact day because there was no ceremony, no farewell. The barge came in, the baskets were sold, and the captain walked away from the pier without knowing it was the end. The river kept flowing, the markets kept bustling, but the particular quiet of a slow journey with fragile cargo vanished almost without notice. Even now, on certain bends of the Po, locals claim you can see the ghosts of the old barges in the water at dawn. Not spectral shapes, but the way the mist folds low and the river lies so still you can almost imagine a low hull gliding past, its baskets of fruit catching the first light. They say if you stand very still, you can smell the faint sweetness of tomatoes in the air, the last trace of a trade that was never famous, never written into ledgers of great events, but once kept whole towns fed in the soft, unhurried way of the river. It was not speed that made them memorable, nor wealth, nor invention. It was the understanding, rare even then, that some things can only be done properly if they are done slowly. And with that, the river kept their silence. If you've made it this far, I hope this quiet journey down the river has helped you drift a little closer to rest. History is full of these small, unhurried stories, and here at Quite Boring Sleep, we're here to tell them, one calm evening at a time. If you'd like to join me for more slow history, please give this video a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet chapter. Until then, sleep well.